Albania, or Shqipëria, an ancient and beautiful land of mountainous terrain, open plains, and a pristine coastal border along the Adriatic Sea, is a country that today reveals little of its tumultuous past.
For 5 centuries, the Albanians, their history and language existed in the Dark Ages, in a foggy period, particularly under 5 centuries of persecution under the Ottoman Empire. And it took the beginning of nationalism at the 19th century and the very beginning of the 20th century for the Albanians began to emerge.
In the mid-14th century, while building their empire and rapidly expanding their domain, the Ottoman Turks were halted in the north of the Albanian territory by one of their own, a man who would become renowned throughout Europe for his successful resistance against the Ottoman army, Skanderbeg Beg. Born in Kruja, Albania, Gjergj Kastrioti, or Skanderbeg Beg, was taken from his family as a young boy for training and service in the Turkish army. As one of the empire's most successful military officers, Skanderbeg Beg returned to his homeland in 1443 to fight on behalf of the Sultan. However, after learning of his family origins there, he faithfully turned against the Ottoman Empire and fought on behalf of the Albanians.
He was one of the first of the Albanians to really raise the banner against the onslaught. And because he was of such an influential military genius, in a sense, this is where his fame comes from. He was able to outsmart and outflank the Ottoman armies on many, many different occasions. And he became feared by the Ottomans because of his ferocity in battle and because of his excellent military skills. So we have here a classic example of someone being taken by the Ottomans, taught their techniques, and then coming back and fighting against those techniques that he was so familiar with.
Despite facing overwhelming odds, Skanderbeg Beg and his troops nevertheless defeated the Turkish army in battle 24 times.
Skanderbeg is and was the Albanian national hero. Skanderbeg is very important to the Albanian people, not only because he held off the Ottomans for so many years, but he is a national symbol, if you will, of Albanian mentality or attitude, to not give in, to fight to the very end, to do what is ever necessary to achieve the end that you're after.
In the end, it was malaria that defeated Skanderbeg Beg. And although his troops battled on, they never achieved the success they had under his leadership.
They have a museum in Albania today in Kruja with his sword and many of the artifacts, so they'll go back to his time. They also have a statue of Skanderbeg Beg that is almost 8 feet tall, and I'm sure history has had a role in increasing the height because I'm sure he wasn't that tall, but that's how much he is thought of highly by the Albanian people.
With the Turks' conquest, the Albanians came under Ottoman rule for nearly 5 centuries. Seeking refuge, thousands of Albanians retreated to the inaccessible regions of the mountains, while others migrated to Greece, Italy, and Egypt, where the first Albanian diasporas began.
The effects of the Ottoman invasion and eventual taking over of all of Albania has really had a disastrous effect on Albania, and some of its effects can still be felt in the country today. When the Ottomans took over the Albanian people, their first effort was to try to extinguish any type of Albanian cultural identity.
Numerous Albanians converted to Islam, not actually in the 15th century when the Ottomans began to control the entire Balkans, but a few centuries later, and it became easier to exist in the Balkans as a Muslim because there were no taxes. Christians had to pay taxes, for example. So those who converted to Islam, in part, were for economic reasons. Others, I'm sure, also for reasons of conscience. Among the Muslims in Albania, for example, a large majority are from the Bektashi sect, which was a sect which blended elements of Christianity as well as Islam together.
In 1453, Constantinople, the capital city of the Byzantine Empire, fell to the Turks. The Greek Patriarch of Constantinople was granted control over all Orthodox Christians in the empire. The Albanians now faced both oppressive Ottoman rule and the Hellenizing dominance of the Orthodox Church in the southern and central regions of Albania. Albanian immigration to the United States began in the mid-1880s with one man seeking economic opportunity in the New World. Coley Christopher was the first Albanian to settle in America. After 6 financially successful years in Boston, he voyaged back to Albania to share his story. Having inspired others, Coley returned to Boston accompanied by 16 men from his home village, Katundi.
My father came to this country in 1912. He had heard about the riches that could be made in America, so he, along with many other Albanians, came to this country, to the United States, but not with the intent in staying. Sociologists refer to this particular type of mentality as sonagers. They came here to visit, to work, to raise money, to send money back to Albania, and then at the same time hope to save enough money to go back to Albania, buy land, or start up a business. And that was my father's intent initially.
Speaking only Albanian and possessing minimal labor skills, employment opportunities were limited for those early immigrants.
When my father came to this country, he was 13 years of age. He worked, I think, in Sexton Can Company. He worked in a shoe factory, and then he graduated to selling bananas. They started on wagons, push carts, and then when things went better, they got a truck. And that was how many of them made it in those early days.
For those early Albanians, life was very, very difficult. Their main interest, of course, as we said, was working and saving and raising money. Their trinity was really, in essence, saving money as much as they possibly could. And they were very successful at it. Many of them did not have any real skills that could be used in this country. Some ended up working in factories as unskilled labor, as my father originally did. But others became pushcart peddlers, especially in Boston. It was a very easy process because all you needed was a pushcart. You went to Fennel Hall, you got your fruits or fish or whatever, and you went out on the streets peddling it. When you decided to go back to Albania, you sold your cart to another Albanian that had just arrived, and life went on.
One early pioneer, Konstantin Nini Demo, arrived in 1903 at the age of 14. Nini documented those early days in his book, The Albanians in America. This historical account and his interviews guide us.
I met Nini Demo back in the 1970s when I was a student at BC, and Nini was about 80 years old. I spoke with Nini in his house in his apartment in South Boston in his kitchen. Nini would tell me many stories of how it was when newcomers came to America. He was a foot soldier, and he was telling me the history of Albania and the Albanians in America, and I heard it firsthand from somebody. And the pride that he had in his heritage was instilled in me in terms of trying to do something for Albania. There was a coffee house, an Albanian coffee house, and it was in Boston. And new arrivals would, who didn't have anyone to go to or had families or the like, would converge on that coffee house. And the people who had been here, the young men like Nini, would meet them there, and they had been working for 60, 70 hours a week, and this is their one chance to come together and to talk. And so a lot of times what they started talking about was politics and what was going on in Albania.
The tenement house served as home for the Albanian men, just as it had for immigrants before them. The men lived crowded together, often 10 to 15 in a single dwelling.
The men at that time lived in what we called konaks, and the konak was a boarding house where the men literally slept and ate and went to work. And my father would tell me when the night shift ended and they came into the konak, the others would get up, get dressed, and go to work in their respective factories. The night shift would then sleep, and then when it was time for them to go back, the day shift would come in. So it was a continuum of sleeping. And that is how it was done, because he told me. And that's what they all went through.
Transients in a foreign land, one immigrant reminds us of the personal struggle they faced.
This is not my country. My body may be in America, but my heart and soul are in the country of my birth.
They remained connected to their homeland and devoted to working towards its independence.
They came to this country to work, but also here they found the freedom to publish. So they became involved very early in publishing newspapers and publications that were disseminated throughout the Albanian colonies in the United States and also made their way back to Albania. So the independence movement for Albania actually began in the United States with the publications of these various newspapers and booklets and pamphlets.
One of those early publications was the Albanian language newspaper Kombi, The Nation. Sotir Peci, an early immigrant, began the newspaper in 1906, and it was Peci who invited Fanoli to Boston to work as his assistant editor. Born in 1882, Theophan Stilian Noli, or Fanoli, lived on an Albanian settlement of eastern Thrace or European Turkey. His family owned a farm, but due to childhood illnesses, Fanoli was not strong enough to work on the family farm. Recognizing his future was not to be a farmer, his family sent him to school to be educated, where he excelled as a student. As a young man, Fanoli worked a series of odd jobs that included promotion and acting for a theater company. Through his travels, he came into contact with members of the Albanian independence movement thriving in Alexandria, Egypt. It was there he became involved in political writing and publication, and it was there that leaders in the community encouraged him to travel to America to assist with the movement arising there. In 1906, Fanoli boarded a ship in Naples with a second-class ticket bound for the United States. Soon after his arrival, Fanoli went to work for Sotir Peci in Boston as his assistant editor. It took 3 people to print Kombi: Peci, Noli, and the typesetter Efthim Nasi. The press was operated by foot. Noli was on the right, feeding the press, Efthim in the middle, pumping it and bobbing up and down to print the pages, and Peci on the left, taking out the finished product. They kept informed of news in the homeland through the publications that were widely circulated. The Albanian community in America responded quickly when they learned that an Albanian patriot, Spiro Kosturi, was murdered for political activism in the city of Salonika, then under Turkish rule.
What they did was they had a huge demonstration. They rented a trolley car. I forget how much money he told me it cost, but he said it was a lot of money for them at that time. And they brought the Albanians from Natick in the trolley car, and they got off and they walked to Park Street Station. And he's in the front, and there's an American flag he's being waved. And he said there was a little handkerchief painting of the Albanian double-headed eagle. And it really, it's kind of a chilly when you're thinking about it. What I got from that story, listening to him, was the first time the Albanian flag is ever in public shown in the United States, and it's in Boston. And it's this little flag, and they wanted to make sure that everyone knew that they were American, that they knew that they loved America, but Albania was their country. There was no Albanian flag. The Albanians were under Ottoman rule. And so for the first time, they're looking at their flag, they're carrying their flag, and they're carrying it in Boston.
Closely following the memorial service, another critical event occurred when a young Albanian man died of the flu in Hudson, Massachusetts.
Krzysztof Desznica died, and they had no one who would officiate at his burial. And these are all Orthodox. These are all Orthodox individuals, and they wanted to have a priest there. And so they went to the service. They read from the Bible. The Albanians themselves, these young men, they read from the Bible, and they buried one of their own. And it was that death and the burial service without any religious ceremony, the officiating, that made them determine that we want something that Albania does not have. we want a church. We want a church of our own. We want an Albanian church with spoken in Albanian. We want someone to be able to officiate, to be able to give us the services that we should have.
And so a great movement occurred in Boston and Massachusetts area, Marlborough, Hudson, Natick, and eventually Worcester, to have our own priest. And there was an election between Sotir Peci, who was a leader, and Fanoli, who was an orator. And Fanoli was selected.
Recognizing the need for a priest of their own, the Albanian community in America, now numbering over 1,500, made a formal appeal to the Russian Orthodox Church for an ordination.
The Russian Orthodox bishop in New York, Metropolitan Platon, had an investigatory commission research it and found that he was suitable, the community could support a priest. And then in 1908, in March of 1908, Fanoli was ordained the first Albanian Orthodox priest.
At the age of 26, Fanoli was ordained by Metropolitan Platon at the Cathedral of St. Nicholas. The Albanian Orthodox Church in America was established as a missionary church under the jurisdiction of the Russian Orthodox Church. Reverend Fanoli returned to Boston, where he celebrated the Divine Liturgy in the Albanian language, having translated it from Greek himself. This historic service was held in a rented hall in Boston on Sunday, March 22, 1908. Many years later, when writing about that day in the newspaper Lydia, Nini Demo simply stated, "Our eyes were filled with tears." That same afternoon, the Albanians of Boston met and organized the Albanian Orthodox Church of St. George. It would be several years before the community acquired a permanent house of worship, and until then, they continued to hold services in rented halls, rebuilding the altar, each week using the icons the men brought from Albania.
The icons are a symbol of God's presence in the community, and the Christian community, and on earth itself. The icons depict different scenes, biblical scenes, or saints, or the Lord Jesus himself or his mother. And the icons are what we call windows to the kingdom, and they give us a view into that transfigured life, that resurrected life. And they're very common not only in the churches, of course, but also in people's homes.
Our church was founded when the Holy Spirit came down on the apostles in the form of tongues of fire and inspired them to speak to all nations various languages which they understood.
In America, the Albanians had the power to achieve what was forbidden in their own country: the freedom to worship in their own tongue. With Albania's future still uncertain, efforts to aid her independence were increased. Numerous political organizations were re-established under the Pan-Albanian Federation of America, known as Vatra, meaning hearth. Now, Vatra and its own weekly publication, Dieli, became instrumental in the struggle for the independence of Albania.
In 1911, the Ottoman Empire began to disintegrate, but with the Balkan Wars prior to World War I, the various states in the Balkans, Greece and Serbia, Romania, Bulgaria, and Albania as well, began to proclaim their independence.
Seizing an opportunity to advance their own cause, the Albanians aligned themselves with the Young Turks, an upstart political group challenging the Ottoman government from within. Fearing the strength of the alliance, a weakened sultan had no choice but to allow for the establishment of a constitutional government. the Albanians felt success had been achieved with the abolishment of the centuries-long ban on the use of the written Albanian language.
The same year, 1908, that our church was established in Boston, the Congress of Monastir established for the first time a uniform Albanian alphabet. So we were seeing linguistic, religious, cultural, political, and ethnic formation of a country at that time.
The Albanians chose the Latin alphabet. However, the Young Turks, determined to suppress an Albanian cultural awakening, decreed the Albanian language be written using Arabic characters. All publishing was banned, and the schools were forcibly closed. The Albanians coalesced as one, rising up in open rebellion. They bonded as Albanians rather than allowing their differences as Muslims, Christian Orthodox, or Roman Catholics to divide them. Guerrilla bands were formed. Vatra supported the rebellion by raising and sending considerable sums of money. And in May of 1912, the Young Turks were defeated.
In 1912, in the city of Lora, in Albania, the Albanian flag was raised for the first time, and Ismail Kemal proclaimed the independence of the state of Albania. The Albanian flag that was raised in Vlora, we feel, came from Boston, because 1 year prior to that, a group of Albanians had traveled from Boston to Corfu, and there met the Marigoya, who was the Betsy Ross of Albania, and sewed the first Albanian flag. Met her and gave her the prototype that we had here from 1908 here in Boston. So we feel that Boston has a special role in the proclamation of the Albanian state in 1912.
True independence was hindered by the Balkan Wars as destabilization continued on the peninsula. The London Conference of Ambassadors was convened to determine a solution in the Balkans, and from across the ocean, the Albanians in America were heard as Vatra sent a flood of telegrams to the dignitaries. The British Foreign Secretary, Sir Edward Grey, was reported to have said, "Tell the Albanians in Boston not to spend so much money on cables. We know that the city of Korça and its districts, so much coveted by the Greeks, are Albanian."
Soon after the priest Vanoli was ordained, he entered Harvard University and graduated, but at the same time, his role as a statesman began to emerge. And he traveled throughout Eastern Europe, from Trieste through Odessa, Russia, including the Balkans, advocating Albanian independence.
But the borders of an independent Albania were threatened once again with the outbreak of World War I. However, the Albanians had an ally in President Woodrow Wilson, who took a stand for independence of their homeland. When asked by Reverend Noli to come to the aid of Albania, Wilson pledged,
I have only one voice at the Paris Peace Conference, and I shall use it on behalf of Albania.
On December 19, 1920, Reverend Noli used his own voice for the security of Albania.
Noli was Albania's representative at the League of Nations and secured the admission of Albania to the League of Nations, which he thought, and most Albanian historians feel, was his most important achievement in the national political sphere, because Albania then was recognized for the first time by an international agency.
Attaining religious freedom was also a struggle, as the Orthodox Christians of Albania sought independence from Greek control. Joachim III, the ecumenical patriarch, continued the Church's mandate against the use of Albanian in the Divine Liturgy.
The Albanian language essentially existed only in the home. It was forbidden in the schools, in churches, in mosques, in all houses of worship, And so it required a great effort and endeavor on the part of the Albanians to assert the use of their own language. The early 20th century saw numerous leaders, as well as included martyrs, such as Papa Christo Negovani and At Stathi Melani, who were martyred because they began serving the liturgy in the Albanian language. And it took time for the country, for the people of Albania to formulate their country, to establish an autocephalous or independent, self-governing Albanian Orthodox Church.
In time, the Albanian Orthodox did declare their independence from Greek control.
A Congress of Berat was held in Albania, which proclaimed the autocephaly, or self-governance, of the Albanian Orthodox Church. Among the leaders there were American Albanian clergy. Father Vanjel Chamche, for example, who was Noli's right-hand man in Boston, and Father Vasil Marko from St. Louis. They had traveled to Albania to assist in the proclamation of the independence of the Church of Albania.
Following the proclamation of the autocephaly of the Church, Reverend Noli, who held a lead role at the Congress of Berat, was consecrated bishop at the Cathedral of St. George in Korça, Albania, in November of 1923. At that time, Bishop Noli was appointed Metropolitan of Durazzo. Metropolitan Noli continued on a dual path, one of religious leader and the other of politician. In June of 1924, Metropolitan Theophan Noli was named Prime Minister of Albania. However, his reign was cut short when Ahmet Zog returned to power after a brief and tense interlude.
Now, Fanoli, as Premier of Albania, was a liberal. One might call him a social democrat in today's terms if one had to pigeonhole him. He felt that Albania needed drastic reforms as it was emerging from the 500-year period under Ottoman rule. And so agrarian reforms were among his leading proposals. His regime lasted only 6 months, mainly because it was the only democratic country in the Balkans surrounded by monarchies. And the monarchies were very fearful of that. And so he was ousted in December of 1924.
Metropolitan Noli was forced to flee Albania forever. He was stranded in Europe for many years due to visa difficulties.
He went through a trying period of exile in Germany and principally in Austria. And some of his most powerful poems and translations of Shakespeare, Ibsen, Cervantes were written during that period. And even today, young people recite some of Bishop Noli's poems, how it feels to be in exile, how it feels to be outside of your homeland.
On riverbanks, where is it that we have left her? Our poor homeland, wretched nation. She lies unwashed at the seaside. She stands unseen in the sunlight. She sits starving at the table. She is ignorant midst learning. Naked, ailing does she languish, lame in body and spirit.
At the conclusion of World War I, it is estimated that close to 30,000 Albanian immigrants returned to the newly independent country. However, few remained there. Feeling little had changed, and with the failure of Metropolitan Noli's government, many made the voyage back to America to settle permanently. The men who were married brought their families here, while single men sought brides in Albania. Now, women and children boarded the ships bound for America. The newly arrived women found few opportunities for work beyond the factories.
My mother worked in the box factory on the line making boxes. She was very good at her work. She was very fast, and they would have liked to have had my mother become a supervisor, but because of her lack of English and being able to count, she was not allowed to become a supervisor. It was very hard. It was very hard for my mother because she wasn't schooled. She schooled herself. She learned the alphabet and how to write her name and how to write letters all on her own without schooling. So that was a big accomplishment for her to be able to write letters when she never was schooled. And we spoke Albanian all the time because that was easy for her. And slowly she learned English, but it was difficult.
Many of the men had been merchants in the Balkans, and once they settled here, they sold their push carts and opened stores.
My father arrived here in America in 1920. However, his brothers and uncles had arrived here in the early teens, and they started opening up spas in Worcester. And my father continued the tradition. He opened up his own spa and several others. And Worcester was a city that was filled with spas. Every neighborhood had them. Every major intersection on the streets had a spa. 90% of the spas in Worcester were owned by Albanians. A spa in 1920s is quite different than the spas of 2008. It's the corner store where the soda fountain, the cigarettes were sold, the fruits were sold, the magazines. That's what a spa was in those years. And they were open 7 days a week.
Numerous Albanians found opportunities for work in the hotel and restaurant industry. For them, learning to speak Greek in the Albanian school system proved to be an asset in this field due to the large number of Greek-owned businesses. And a familiar and rapidly expanding trade provided employment to a number of the men.
Well, people wonder where the term banana man comes from. I guess goes back. I consider myself a third-generation banana man, starting with my grandfather around 1912, thereabouts. He lost his store, but he kept his truck. And with that truck, he started hauling bananas. And eventually he moved to Boston, and to be closer to the source at the fruit company pier in Boston. And other Albanians got into the very difficult business of hauling and handling bananas. They were stems then. They were 60 to 120 pounds apiece. They were carried on your shoulder. And their businesses grew as the banana business grew. It was a new business when they first started.
As the Albanian population in America grew, so too did the church. By the year 1919, the number of Albanian Orthodox parishes had grown to 6. St. Nicholas in Southbridge, Massachusetts, holds the distinction of being the first church to be built completely from the ground up by its parishioners, opening its doors in 1912. And in 1922, the Boston community purchased a church on Emerald Street, giving them their first permanent home. Concern grew for families still living in the homeland, as Albania, like most of Europe, was becoming increasingly unstable.
My father came to the United States in 1920, and then he came back to Albania in 1925 to marry my mother. My dad came back to the United States, opened up his little business, and he made 6 trips back and forth. And it was always his idea to make enough money here so that he could buy land in Albania and retire there. This last trip in 1936, he left Albania and went to Bari, Italy, and he had many friends in Bari. Bari has probably 500,000 Albanians, and they said to my father, "You better go back there and get your family out. Things don't look good in Europe." So my dad immediately sent telegrams saying, "Okay, sell the house and let's get moving."
As World War II loomed, a mass migration occurred, and the last and largest wave of immigrants made the journey across the ocean.
Off we go to Tirana. And in Tirana, that's the first time I'd been in the restaurant to eat a full meal and stay in a hotel. And we really didn't know what we were doing. You know, we were lost. So from Tirana, then we went into Durs. And in Durs, the ship took us across the Adriatic into Bari, Italy. Well, when we saw the ship, we said, oh my God, it's not too big. How are we going to go across the Atlantic on this? And we were all worried. But we got on there and we got at Bari, Italy, and they picked us up in Bari in a bus. We went to a hotel. Then they took us to the Union Station. My God, we had never seen a train. There was never a train in Albania. We'd seen a bus and a train all within 2 days, and a ship. We got to Naples, they picked us up and brought us to the docks. And we saw this enormous ship, the Rex. I had no idea of how big it really was until later years I looked it up, and it was 900 feet long.
Large neighborhoods of recently arrived and long-established Albanians sprouted up in all the communities.
I lived in Somerville. I lived on Century Street. Downstairs, there were Albanians. Across the street, there were Albanians. And we had 2 grocery stores, very close to each other. And we didn't have a need for anyone outside of the Albanian community. And that's all I knew, and I was happy with that. Name days, if anybody was sick, we'd always visit each other, and they were all Albanians. Even when I moved up the street, we were all Albanians. That's where they all moved to be together. I think that's probably one of the reasons we were in that little community of Albanians in Somerville. It was nice.
Bonded by common ethnicity and faith, their socializing revolved around the church and Albanian cultural organizations. New customs were established and old traditions were continued as social gatherings became large and frequent affairs.
The AANO sponsored dances, and particularly in November, they celebrated the Independence Day of Albania. They rented a ballroom in Boston and advertised to the different churches. And those of us who lived in Worcester, it was a big event for us because you had to come all the way in.
When they had these dances, those were very, very special events. Everyone would get dressed up fancy. I can remember the taffeta dresses that were out like this, you know, and everything matched. You had to have shoes that matched your dress and whatever. And you went to the dances, and it was like, you know, all the girls would line up and all the boys would line up, and eventually someone would ask someone to dance. It was, people were very shy compared to today. And the dances were big. They could have been 300 to 500 people in the big hotels in Boston, like the Bradford and other ones. And it was something that everyone looked forward to.
The church picnic began with the early immigrants, as the men would gather in a field on a Sunday to meet and discuss events both near and far. And the tradition continued through the years to the present day.
A very important part of our social life were the picnics. Everybody looked forward to the picnics. We were very fortunate that we had a piece of land that one of our very active priests, the late Artemi Theodos, had bought a piece of property, and he donated it to the church. And we held all our outside activities at this piece of property. We had our picnics out there, our gatherings out there. People would come from all over to get together at them. We called it the Manastir. We were at the Manastir, and we would be wanting to cook, and naturally, what to cook? Shish kebab, that was the big thing, the lamb. And so the men just got together, gathered all kinds, there was loads of stones around the land that they could pick up and they built this huge, huge fireplace. And when I say huge, I mean huge. And as they worked, they sang. As they cooked, they sang. And of course, that would draw everybody to stand around the fireplace to listen to the singing and watching the meat getting cooked and waiting for the meat to cook, because you couldn't wait for that. That was the best part, waiting for that meat to cook.
In time, there were many new marriages to celebrate in the rapidly expanding community.
The marriage ceremony itself is really broken into two parts. The betrothal service, which is the first part of the marriage, in which rings are exchanged, symbolic of commitment to one another, but also eternity, as the circle is the symbol of eternity. The couple are betrothed, and in the early church this was done generally earlier than the marriage was, where they were promised to each other, usually through some matchmaker or a family would say, this is who we're going to marry, and everything is all set. And then later on the wedding service would take place. But today we push them together. The marriage service itself, or as actually the Orthodox Church calls it, it's actually called the crowning, in which case literally crowns are placed on the heads of the husband and wife. In some of the Greek or Mediterranean traditions, they actually use flowers or laurel leaves to crown the couple as king and queen of their new house. The expectation in the marriage service is that they will produce children. It's not a secret, and it's made very openly. The prayers are that they will rejoice at the sights of sons and daughters, that they will spring up like olive shoots around their table,